Hey y'all, welcome to the Southern Appalachian Herbal Podcast. I'm Judson Carroll and I'm an herbalist. I'm also a wild crafter, a gardener, and herb grower. I'm coming to you from high atop the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, just a stone's throw from the Tennessee line, overlooking the Pisgah National Forest, absolutely surrounded by the bounty of God's green earth. I spent most of my life wandering these mountains and learning about plants from the old timers and all sorts of characters. On this show, we'll talk about herbs and how to use them, how to find them, how to grow them, how to make preparations. We'll talk about a lot of things. We can also talk about permaculture, homesteading, foraging, and living off the land. Most anything, really. You can email me at southernappalachianherbs@gmail.com if you have a question or a comment. You can also contact me through the Grow Network, where I'm a regular contributor and a moderator for the forums. And my blog is, of course, southernappalachianherbs@blogspot.com. All right, y'all. I'm going to sit my guitar down and let's talk about herbs. Hey, y'all. Welcome to show number 9. I hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas. And it's now time for a New Year's special. And what better for New Year's than to have something to toast with? So let's talk about herbal wines and beers. A lot of people are really surprised to find out that traditionally, well through the Middle Ages, most herbs were taken infused in, or made in, actually fermented in, wines and beers. And it's a fascinating history, and it's a neat topic. It's still a good thing to do today, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. Well, before we get into that, I found a good new way of using thyme last night. If you remember from our Thanksgiving special, I talked about how thyme, the culinary herb, is also a good medicinal herb, especially for colds and coughs, congestion, chest colds, that kind of thing, any kind of respiratory issues. I recently rediscovered some old material that Julia Child put out around 1980 called The Way to Cook. And it's just a nice kind of basic introduction. And I was kind of flipping through there and I noticed that she did her hamburgers in a way I had never thought of doing before. And I gave this a try. It's really good. So I'm just going to go ahead and share you the recipe with you now. All right. So I had about a pound and a half of hamburger meat. It was probably about 80-20, 80% lean, 20% fat. Could have been a little fattier than that. I don't remember exactly. To that, mixed in 1 egg, a tablespoon of sour cream, about a half teaspoon of dried thyme, salt and pepper, mix it all up real well, and then lightly floured each side of the patty, pan fried in butter and oil. And let me tell you, best pan fried hamburger I've ever had. Great way to get some time into your diet and into your family's diet, because who doesn't love a good hamburger? Um, it was really interesting to me, putting a little flour on the outside of the patty. I'd never tried that before. It really sealed in the juices. I had a nice juicy pan-fried hamburger, and of course the butter and oil mixture was really good. And the sour cream, wow, that was a surprise too. It kind of reminded me of the old Shoney's Big Boy hamburgers. And that was a great chain that went out of business, I guess, about 20 years ago. Um, anyway, to my memory, and of course I haven't had a Shoney's Big Boy in well over 20 years. Yeah, that's what they tasted like. They were always pretty good hamburgers. So anyway, give that a try and see if you like it. Now, on to the show. All right, I could not do a show on beer and wine or any kind of alcohol without dedicating it to 3 great men. The first was my grandfather. My family has a long tradition of making wine and cider. In fact, in the backyard of the house, the old farmhouse, we walked off the back porch and down a little brick pathway that he had laid out. There was something that looked like a huge old canoe, like a dugout canoe, but it was flat at both ends, and one end had a hole in it. And what they would do, I believe this came from probably his grandfather or his great grandfather's farm. I mean, it was that old. This is well over probably 250 years old, sitting back there. Um, you would put one end up, put rocks under it, fill the whole like canoe looking thing with apples or grapes, and then take a big mallet and start crushing them up, and the juice would run out the hole in the end. That's how they would crush their apples and grapes and plums and whatever they wanted to turn into wine or cider. And my grandfather made wine, of course. And, you know, growing up, I'd see the carboys. Those are big glass jugs. You think of the old jugs they used to have at water coolers. That's what those are. Usually 5 gallons. But he'd have it full of muscadine wine with a little airlock on top of it. Um, Back then, the only place you could order those was from another one I'm going to dedicate this to, the great George Leonard Herder, my personal hero. Um, I got into making wine and cider late teens, I'll just say around 18, and the first batch I made was phenomenal. This was before we had internet. I did not know where to buy stuff. I did not have online shopping that was not available. I had one book, and it was the first book I ever read by George Leonard Herder. Now, Mr. Herder is probably the greatest American author you've never heard of. He was self-published. He owned Herder's Waseka. I guess that's the way you pronounce it. I'm not from Minnesota, so I'm going to go with Waseka or Waseka. That was the predecessor to the big sporting goods stores, like a Bass Pro Shops or an Outdoor World. If you've ever seen the show Last Man Standing, and you think of the main character that does the vlogs, he's brash and conservative, libertarian, outspoken, great sense of humor. You know, that was George Leonard Herder, and I would not be surprised if they based that show on Herder. He wrote probably 15 to 20 books, most of them well over 400 pages each. He he wrote at least 5 cookbooks, 3 of which are absolute classics called The Bull Cook. He wrote one on sourdough bread making, and well, if you read him, you'll know he's a hero of mine. These books were not only full of survival tips. He did, professional guides manual. He did one on building cabins. He did all kinds of stuff about gathering wild food. Great recipes all over the world. He was a very well traveled man. Hunting stories, tall tales, historical anecdotes. A lot of times I think he just made the stuff up, getting a kick out of it, thinking how people would read it and believe it. He was just a real character, a real nut. But um, I mean, this guy used to hunt with John Wayne and fish with Ernest Hemingway, and I mean, just an absolute American legend. His marketing technique was sort of like P.T. Barnum or Ziegfeld, was Lorenz Ziegfeld at the Ziegfeld Follies. So I'm going to read the title of his winemaking book. This is what I started with: How to Make the Finest Wines at Home in Old Glass or Plastic Bottles and Jugs for as little as 10 cents a gallon by George L. Hurd. And I did, okay? I don't know if I got under 10 cents a gallon, but the first batch I made, like I said, I had no equipment. I had no idea what I was doing except for what I had read in this book because my grandfather passed away and all I had was memories of how he did things. Went to the store and got a gallon of apple juice, just the purest apple juice I could get. I was trying to avoid the corn syrup and all that, which is even harder to do now. Brought that to a simmer, mixed in a bag of sugar, probably 4 gallons of plain old white sugar. Put that in a jug that was big enough to hold it. Only yeast I have is bread yeast, so I put that in there after it cooled down enough. I did not have a fermentation lock, an airlock. What I did was I took a bunch of plastic drinking straws, the bendy kind, joined them together and taped up the seams into a long tube. Over one end, I took a paper towel and folded it into, a long strip, long rectangular strip, wrapped that in plastic wrap, wrapped that around the straw until I made a bung that would fit tightly into the top of that jug. So I had the straw in there, sealed off, brought it around, put the other straw into a glass of water. That's all I had. And I would sit there for hours watching the thing bubble. I was absolutely fascinated by fermentation. And that first batch, I let it go for about a month, bottled it up, let it clear, and it tasted like fantastic champagne. And I was absolutely hooked on a new hobby. After that, I mean, I just, full steam ahead, making beers and wines and ciders, and it's just so much fun. But the thing is, It used to be the primary way in which medicinal herbs were given. I mean, at least as popular as tea. I mean, everybody can make tea. But you got to remember, in much of Europe and throughout the world, the water was really not clean. So people drank a lot of beer and wine, a lot. I mean, it was very common for people to get up in the morning and drink like a quart of beer. They were not tame beers. This was not low alcohol stuff. I mean, somehow we got some wrong-headed notions in this country. If you look at our founders, they were all distillers and winemakers and brewers. Our preachers, our theologians, they were all heavy drinkers, basically. And they did it responsibly. Somehow people could actually be responsible back then and build a country. Now, well, I won't get into politics. I'm going to avoid that today. So, the tinctures didn't become popular in herbal medicine until well into the Middle Ages. I mean, distillation of alcohol began well, probably in China and the Middle East. Um, Really primitive, like alchemists, distillation started showing up maybe around 100 BC around Rome. But I mean, as far as actually distilling alcoholic beverages into like brandy would have been the first one as a way to preserve wine. That didn't really catch on for a long time. People had their wine and they had their beers and their ciders, their country wines, and they would preserve their herbs in that. And there's still evidence of this today. Um, I think of vermouth. Okay, vermouth is that heavily spiced and herbed wine that one makes a martini with. Take dried vermouth and gin, and you got a nice martini. I'm particularly fond of sweet vermouth, and that's one of the few sweet things I do like. But when I have it, it'll be on a hot day, and I like to have it with over ice, a little club soda. It's just very refreshing. Not much alcohol, just really really nice on the taste buds. Right now, I am sipping on a homemade ginger ale. I'll get into that in just a second. I'm going to take a sip of it. Oh, it's delicious. Um, Let me go ahead before I forget and talk about the third fellow I was going to mention. Popcorn Sutton, my old friend Popcorn Sutton. He was a famous moonshiner, and a friend introduced me to him at a festival. It was a little bluegrass, old time music and storytelling festival, and Arvil Hicks introduced me to Popcorn. He said, "You need to meet this fella. He's the most famous moonshiner in North Carolina." And I walked back there, we're backstage, and there's this little scrawny guy with a big bushy beard that was probably half of his body weight, crazy looking eyes. If you've ever seen Popcorn, you know what I'm talking about. And we just hit it off. I mean, we just started chatting about fermentation and distillation and all kinds of stuff. And I never made a run of moonshine with him or anything, but whenever we saw each other, we just hang out and talk. And one of the biggest regrets of my life is that he offered to build me a still. Couldn't afford it, and I was moving to Georgia. And well, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little warning now, and Popcorn brings that warning up. It is legal, as far as I know, in every state of the United States. Maybe your county has an ordinance you want to look into, but under federal law, it is legal to make beer and wine for personal and family consumption and use. Okay? You can't sell it. That's illegal. That's considered bootlegging. But you can make it. What you cannot do is take a bottle of wine and put it in a pot, boil it, and condense the steam. That's illegal. That's just breaking the law. That you've broken the law right there. You're going to go to jail if you get caught. Now, Popcorn, he had been a moonshiner and a bootlegger, a runner for many, many years, and he'd been in and out of jail. And then he became famous. Now, see, before he became famous, everybody in the county, everybody in the western part of the state, and half of Tennessee was buying from him, including all the local law enforcement, most likely. But when he became famous, he made the authorities look bad. And the way I heard it, maybe I don't have all the details right, was he basically got set up on an illegal gun charge. Someone sold him a stolen handgun or traded for it. And facing a jail term he could not handle, he killed himself. And I think that was absolutely wrong that people who had been his friends and his buyers the day before basically killed the man. But that is the danger if you decide to. So don't do it unless you're willing to take the risk, unless you're willing to Do the time for the crime, as they say. So now on to more pleasant topics. Back to vermouth. Vermouth is actually Old German for wormwood. Wormwood infused wine has been recommended by everyone from Pliny and Hippocrates to St. Hildegard of Bingen. You may wonder, how could somebody drink such a bitter substance and why? Well, bitters are good for the liver and the stomach. They help digestion, and wormwood was a cure for intestinal worms. That's why it's called wormwood. And that's the ancestor of our modern day vermouth. Um, I believe it was an Italian wine merchant that branded it basically based on old Benedictine herbal formulas and turned it into the famous beverage we know today. Now, I don't believe there is a brand of vermouth sold in the United States right now that still contains wormwood. Wormwood got a bad rap sometime around 1800 when artists started drinking too much absinthe and going nuts. Well, they were drinking a 180 proof liqueur by the gallon. It probably didn't have a whole lot to do with the thujone and the wormwood, but I mean, Van Gogh was known to drink paint thinner. I mean, he wasn't exactly discriminating in his taste, and for some reason they blamed it all on wormwood, and people have been weird about it ever since. Well, don't worry about that. Why would you make your own wines today and use them herbally? Well, for one thing, the taste. I mean, like I said, try some vermouth. It's full of all kinds of herbs and spices, and you can cook with it, you can drink it, and it's going to affect your palate and the way you uh, enjoy foods more than you can ever imagine. Um, Dry vermouth, often used in French cooking with fish, for instance. We'll put it in with a poaching liquid. You can experiment with all kinds of flavors of these herbs, but you can also get medicinal properties. Um, that medicinal value of that herb is just as well preserved in wine as it is in an alcohol tincture made from, corn liquor or, vodka, whatever you're going to use in there. You can make your tinctures out of brandy, whatever. But the wine is going to do just as good a job. It may even do a better job. You see, the way alcohol is made is yeast convert sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Um, it is basically they're like little creatures that eat sugar and burp. But what they actually are is fungi. Your yeast that you make beer and wine and bread with are in the same family as mushrooms. And we're learning now how medicinal mushrooms can be. Peter McCoy is probably if he's not the top expert in mycology in the United States, he's definitely in the top five. His book, Radical Mycology, is just brilliant. I suggest anyone read it. He especially has a great chapter on public education and how we all ended up so dumb when our ancestors just 100 and 200 years ago were brilliant. And what does that have to do with mycology? Well, you'll have to read his book to find out. He tells you all about mushrooms. He theorizes that when the yeasts um, are doing their job, if you ferment the herbs with what you're turning into alcohol, what I mean is if you had grape juice and you introduce yeast and whatever medicinal herbs you want, you put them in at the time, the yeast actually consume some of those herbs and make them more bioavailable and make it more strong medicinally. It's an old theory, and I think it probably does have some relevance to it as we're learning to understand how the fungi and bacteria, like in our gut biome, affects our health, our brain health, our physical health, our immune system. That yeast is a big part of it, and it's doing its thing, digesting what's in that liquid. Well, some things you may not want to ferment with the yeast, though. Those would be your antimicrobial herbs. So usually the bark of a plant that you'll put in water and it'll actually kill the bacteria. And you can drink the water and it's safe. Well, obviously, if those barks and such would kill the bacteria in there, they're probably not going to be too good on the yeast, the fungi that you're making wine out of. You may disrupt the process. Those you would infuse after the wine's made. When the wine's made, the yeast settles to the bottom and clears, then put it in. But the other thing, speaking of St. Hildegard, is herbal beers. Few people know, but St. Hildegard is the one that introduced hops to beer making. See, before hops came into common use in beer, other herbs were used as bittering agents and preservatives for the beer. And the most popular of those, at least in Europe, was called Groot. Now, an interesting book you can read, Sacred and Healing Beers, Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers, by Stephen Herod Bruner. It's one of the best herb books you can get, and he has gone through and he's got the history of all these herbal beers. And Groot was the main one before hops. The herbs used in it were myrtle gale, also called sweet gale or bog myrtle, yarrow, and what they called wild rosemary, which was actually Ledum palustre, or called marsh rosemary. It's not in the rosemary family. In fact, I believe both of these, the wild rosemary and the sweet gale, are in the heath family. They're really interesting because they were bitter, but they are also slightly narcotic. And apparently, people really like that beer. And when the church leaders at the time tried to convince them to switch over to hops, people didn't like it a whole lot because the hops had the opposite effect. Whereas before they were drinking the beer and they were singing and dancing and fighting and having a big old time on a Saturday night, now their beer was making them sleepy. But eventually everyone did switch over to hops. It actually became law. The I think it's Pure Beer Act. It was a German law. And a lot of that had to do with politics and the merchants, the trading of the hops, the ability to kind of take the beer making out of the cottage and turn it into a business. But it also had to do with the slight toxicity of those three herbs that they used to use. So the herbs people used in beer, I mean, they made nettle beer. They made, and when I'm saying beer, what I mean is they malt grains and they ferment them and add these herbs during the time of fermentation. So the nettle beer would have had a lot of vitamin C, would have been good for colds and allergies. They would put burdock in their beer. That's a mildly bitter herb, good for the liver. Dandelion, dandelion wine can be made from the flowers, but they would use the roots in the beer. Um, well, ginger beer. Well, that reminds me of what I'm sipping on right now. This is my homemade ginger ale. It's a ginger beer, really. It's about 6 weeks old today. It's still a little on the sweet side for my taste, so I'm going to bottle it up and let it dry a little bit and carbonate a little bit. Right now it's flat because just had it under the airlock. Um, and try to get a couple weeks, but it's really delicious. I'm going to just go ahead and give you the recipe for this so you can see how easy it is to do. All I did to make this, I got out a stock pot, put in a couple gallons of water. I had 10 pounds of raw sugar. Um, just dissolve that in the water. Put the zest of about oh, 8 or 9 limes. Let's just say 10 limes. And then the juice of those limes. Grated up 2 hands of ginger. Roll that to a nice simmer. Let it cool down. Um, I cooled it with additional cold water until I got to basically room temperature, body temperature. If I stuck my finger in there. And then I added Red Star Premier Cuvée yeast. That's just a simple winemaker's yeast. It's good for doing country wines or ciders, things like when you're not using grapes. You can pick up a pack of those for maybe $5 for three if you go to a brew shop. But I happen to order just one pack off of eBay for $2. Why did I get one pack? Well, because when this ginger ale, probably tomorrow I'm going to do this, I'm going to transfer it from one carboy to another. That's going to leave all this yeast sitting on the bottom, and I'm just going to start another batch right in that old yeast. It's just like sourdough bread. You can use one package of yeast over and over and over. So that's how easy it is. You just let it ferment for, I guess, like I said, I'm up to 6 weeks now, and it's just delicious. Oh, the other thing I added to it that I forgot to mention was a pint of molasses, and that gives a nice body and a dark richness to it. It's really very good. It's maybe 12% alcohol, so it's like a mild white wine. And I mean, the ginger's very medicinal and lots of nice vitamin C and flavonoids from the lime. So this is what I would consider an herbal wine or herbal beer. I didn't make it with grain. We'll call it a wine. Okay. All right. So let me see. You know what? I'm going to just grab a couple of these historic recipes and just give you an overview. Sassafras, obviously. Sarsaparilla. Wintergreen. Now that's an interesting one. People used to use wintergreen and juniper to make their beers. And there's a really interesting history of that up in the Netherlands. Licorice was a common ingredient. St. John's wort. Now there's an interesting beer, isn't it? St. John's wort, which helps regenerate nerves, but also is known for helping with depression mixed in with beer. Now that's going to lift your spirits a little bit, don't you think? Sweet flag or calamus, often used. Meadowsweet, borage, horehound, um, calendula, elderberry, elderflower. I mean, so many, any herb, like I said, that would taste good and that you would tincture can be made into a beer or an ale. Um, Caraway, now that's a nice one. Caraway is going to help settle your stomach. It's going to be good to have with a meal. Dock, cowslip. Cowslip was very popular. In fact, in England, the cowslip became endangered because so many people picked it to make into beer. I mean, it was just their favorite ingredient. It has certain relaxing qualities and apparently went really well with it. Pennyroyal, that one could potentially be a little dangerous. I don't know if I'd use pennyroyal. Um, Definitely does have its medicinal values, though. I just wouldn't have too much of it. Betony. Betony is um, okay. Betony has a strong relaxant quality. Betony is almost a sedative, so you can see why people would mix that with their alcohol. Ground pine, of course, hops, um, buckbean, tansy, all these things, and you can find these recipes in that book, Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers. Now I'm going to move on and reference some wine. All right, another good book, The Drunken Botanist, The Plants That Create the World's Great Drinks by Amy Stewart. Now this is an interesting, and she goes again to the history, a lot like the other book did, but she includes, it's more on the lines of wines as opposed to the beers. And so you've got allspice, aloe. Aloe is very good for the stomach and the liver. That would be a good thing. But here's Angelica. Now, this was a favorite additive to wines in Europe, and it's still included in chartreuse, Fernet, vermouth, and Benedictine and Drambuie. Angelica is great for colds. It's great for asthma. I mean, you know, you could definitely see Angelica in a nice wine. Artichoke, cardoon, bay laurel. That would be a lot like the myrtle gale. Um, Gosh, in some places they even put betel nut in there. I don't think I'd do that. I don't. That would be like those people that mix Red Bull and vodka. That's not my thing. A stimulant mixed with your alcohol. Um, Cardamom. That would be very nice. Clove. Yeah. Coriander, fenugreek. So, I mean, any of these are options. Grains of paradise, lemon verbena, anise hyssop, regular hyssop, nutmeg and mace. Possibilities are literally limitless. But why? Again, why would you want to do this? What makes a benefit in using wine instead of a tincture? Well, like I said, the flavors. I mean, you can come up with really interesting beverages, but say you're just interested in the medicinal quality. Well, like I said, the yeast is fungus that can make the herb stronger potentially. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if Peter McCoy says it, he's probably right. What's another benefit? Well, it's back to Mr. Herder's title. How to make the finest wines at home in old glass or plastic bottles and jugs for as little as 10 cents a gallon. Now, look, I don't care if you're making your tinctures with Everclear or Bowman's vodka. Okay, Bowman's is what, $5 a bottle, 80 proof. Everclear is much more expensive and much higher proof. Neither one of them is going to be 10 cents a gallon, is it? But if you had access to grapes, if you have a grapevine, if you have an apple tree, pear tree, plum tree, you name it, any kind, peaches, any fruit that you can crush, right there, that is free for the taking. All you need to do is figure out a way to crush it. You can spend a couple $100 to get a fruit crusher and press, or you can put your fruit in a bucket, take a little 3 pound sledgehammer, wrap a Ziploc bag around it, and crush everything up that way inside the bucket. If you're particularly strong, you can put in a towel or a pillowcase and squeeze the liquid out of it that way, twisting and wringing it out. There's a million ways to crush fruit and juice it. Some people use a system that steams the juice out. I don't really like that because it gives it sometimes a cooked flavor. But anyway, that's one option. Okay. Then there's just plain old sugar wash. I mean, the cheapest form of alcohol there is. It is nothing but sugar dissolved in water, a little citric acid, and yeast. Tastes horrible, but it's probably, I mean, honestly, no worse than Everclear. Um, I'm not a fan of vodka. I mean, some people really like vodka. To me, the most expensive vodkas just taste like nothing. The more money you pay, the more it tastes like plain water. I don't get that. To me, sugar wash and vodka are about the same level. Um, but you can make your wines out what I did here was sugar and ginger and citrus and molasses. Anything that has sweetness, real sugar, can be fermented and turned into alcohol by the yeast. You can control the amount of alcohol. That's another great part of this. If you did, say, a gallon of wine and you only put a pound of sugar in it, you're going to have like maybe a 3 or 4% alcohol. That's all. If someone had an issue where they didn't want to have a whole lot of alcohol, it's a great way to go. You can put in, say, 5 pounds of sugar to a gallon, and you're going to end up with maybe 18% alcohol. You could get real risky and distill that and make your own craft gin, or you could make your own tinctures with the distillate. And I'm going to warn you not to do that, but if you do it, you can do it. Trust me. If we ever have some sane laws in this country, maybe everybody will be able to have a little stovetop still. The only reason these laws are in place is because of the tax man. So these are the benefits. Inexpensive, ability to tailor things to your own taste, the fun of making it. It's really fun to make this stuff. There's a little science involved, there's a little art involved, and you can get your taste buds involved, and I mean, why not? So, Happy New Year, everybody. Now, I know you don't have time to make your own wine right now to toast on New Year's Eve, but you can always add some herbs to whatever wine you have on hand. Just let them sit for a day and sip. Just store-bought wine, whatever herbs you want to use, so long as they're, no toxicity to them and they taste good, just infuse that in the wine. A couple days, a week, it'll be great. If you don't have that much time, hey, get your, New Year's Eve champagne and just make a little herbal cocktail with it. You can take, let's say, a little bit of lemon zest, few caraway seeds, just bruised up. That would be to my taste. Maybe a little fennel or celery leaf in there. But, you could use sweeter herbs. You could use culinary herbs. I mean, it's really interesting how some of the more like what we think of savory culinary herbs give a sweet floral aroma to wine. Basil, rosemary, thyme, you know, sky's the limit. Have fun with it. Drink responsibly, be safe, be healthy, use herbs, and have a fantastic 2021. They always say, don't say it couldn't get any worse. I won't. But 2021 has a pretty low bar to cross to beat 2020. I think we all have to admit that. So Happy New Year, everybody. Have a good one. Oh, and as my old, well, I guess I can't call him a friend, but someone I had a little communication with, Kinky Friedman, the the interesting, shall we say, the eccentric cowboy country singer and mystery writer from Texas always says, "May may the best of the past be the worst of the future." That's my toast for you. The information in this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or condition. Nothing I say or write has been evaluated or approved by the FDA. I'm not a doctor. The U.S. government does not recognize the practice of herbal medicine, and there is no governing body regulating herbalists. Therefore, I'm really just a guy who studies herbs. I'm not offering any advice. I won't even claim that anything I write or say is accurate or true. I can tell you what herbs have been traditionally used for. I can tell you my own experience and if I believe an herb has helped me. I cannot nor would I tell you to do the same. If you use an herb anyone recommends, you are treating yourself. You take full responsibility for your health. Humans are individuals and no two are identical. What works for me may not work for you. You may have an allergy, a sensitivity, an underlying condition that no one else even shares and you don't even know about. Be careful with your health. By continuing to listen to my podcast or read my blog, you agree to be responsible for yourself, do your own research, make your own choices, and not to blame me for anything ever.